what are those qualities? Can you recall the four qualities and the varieties of religious experiences?
William James, I think, it's noetic, transient. I fail my William James quiz. Yeah, they're noetic, they're transient.
Ineffability, noetic, transiency, and passivity.
Yeah. And they happen to you. They're not a thing that you can induce, which is becomes controversial in the Renaissance because there are philosophers who are going to attempt to induce them in the so-called occult philosophy. So what William James argues is that they're noetic, which is to say they have intellectual content. They're not always noetic, but they can be noetic. And they can be noetic in a way that is propositional. So you can, have an experience, have an intellectual content, and you can say something like, well, the universe is all fundamentally one thing. It's a very common mystical experience, the unity of all being. So that's a propositional aspect. They're passive, which is to say you typically can't induce them. They happen to you. As opposed to, it's not like you can sit down and go, okay, now it's time to have a mystical experience. And it doesn't work like that. You have to meditate, and sometimes you get that katsu moment where you're hit with it, but you can't really induce it typically. They're transient. They don't last forever. Mystical experiences typically, they can happen in just a blink of an eye. The most famous example is Jakob Böhme, a cobbler, simple cobbler, shoemaker, saw God and all the universe in a piece of polished pewter and based an entire mystical experience system on this one moment where he saw everything in the gleam of a piece of polished pewter. So you never know where it's going to come from, but he couldn't have manifested that. It happened to him passively. And they're transient. They don't last long, or they only last for a very specific period of time. And
ineffability.
Ineffability. That is often to say that you can't ever grasp in words completely what you experience. But that never stops mystics. Mystics, if you've ever read any of the famous mystics, they will throw a pile of words, volumes and volumes and volumes, trying to get at the thing that they experienced. And they will always happily admit to you, they use the language of St. Thomas Aquinas, who after, if you've ever read the massive works of Thomas Aquinas, he had a mystical experience toward the end of his life and famously said, everything I've written is straw compared to what I saw. It's just, he's one of the greatest philosophers and theologians in Western history. So in that way, they're ineffable. You can't put into words exactly what it is that you experienced. So these are the qualities that James lays out. And I think that that's a useful typography. I don't think, for instance, that all mystical experiences in history are noetic. Some of them are emotional. There's no intellectual content at all. You're just feeling something. Some of them are noetic without being propositional. And notice this is odd because noesis typically involves propositional statements like all is one or something like that. There's a propositional statement, which can be true or false. But ineffability goes against that because ineffability means, by definition, you can't put it into words. And so I think what's nice about the Jamesian typology is it captures what we often notice in mystical experiences, which is some high degree of paradox. And you see in texts like the Sefer Zohar, the foundational text of the Kabbalah, they'll use examples when they'll call God the shining darkness. They're trying to break your brain. They're trying to break your consciousness. And they're like, look, whatever you think this thing is, it's not that, right? And so you use a phrase like the shining darkness. And you're like, what exactly is that supposed to be doing? And they're trying to get you to realize that there's something paradoxical about these experiences. And I think that at the heart of the Jamesian typology, there's a lovely kind of paradox where noesis meets ineffability. And that's just like putting two magnets together that don't want to go together.
Yeah.
So in that way, it's a nice manifestation of the paradoxical nature of mysticism at the very heart of the very typology of mysticism itself. So it's in that way, it's quite poetic.
So individuals who have mystical experiences typically report back, not just they encountered something that was just true for them, but something that was fundamentally true about the nature of reality and true for all people at all times. Mm-hmm. And that's where the noetic aspect comes in, where it becomes self-evident in my experience. There's obviously some problems with that. It's happening inside of me. You can't really see that from the external end. You could examine the fruits that come from that and make your own judgment on that. But what do you make of that reoccurrence that throughout millennia, we have had so many different mystics that have had these experiences that make them feel like there is a fundamental unicity. Obviously, there's a lot of people that have come with different theories that were built on top of that in terms of dual aspect monism or so what do you make of that recurrence from the various different mystics throughout the ages?
Well, what all mystics share in common is that we all have the same brain, basically. So it's unsurprising that given the fact that we all have the same brain, we're going to get similar kinds of experiences, just of the world in general. We're sharing a pretty similar, probably not identical, but pretty similar experience of being in this room. And unsurprisingly, mystics share some degree of similarities. Now, what's interesting is that there's not uniformity across the mystical tradition. So some mystics will posit a kind of fundamental unity about the world. The Gnostics posited a fundamental duality about the world. Now, both of these can't be true, And importantly also is that there's no mystics who exist outside culture. They're always existing with their backdrop, with their own cultural and religious backdrop. For instance, a medieval Christian mystic isn't probably going to see a vision of Krishna.
Right.
It's just not their cultural backdrop. A Advaita Vedanta mystic isn't going to see a vision of Quetzalcoatl probably, because that's just not their cultural framework. And so even the propositional data, we might call it sort of the more pure propositional philosophical data that emerges from mysticism, is always against that cultural and religious backdrop. So unsurprisingly, it takes those forms. Also, it's often quite conservative as well. This is a thing that I think many people are somewhat shocked by, is that I think of a mystic like Bernard of Clairvaux, the most important love mystic in the Western tradition. He was enthusiastic about the Second Crusade. So he was like, yeah, love God and love everybody, but kill the infidels. And we look at that and go, that really is a jarring juxtaposition where, God is love and you experience God and seeing love in another human being's face and they all have to die. And you're just like, what? It's like, of course, because he's living in the background of the cultural background of Christianity at that time. So unsurprisingly, has these sort of what strike us as very shocking things. So I think what's important is that, again, there are these sort of universal things, but often they're universal only in a very low resolution analysis. When you get into a high resolution analysis of them, it turns out they don't agree with each other at all. Very rarely do we get like a high degree of uniformity across mystical lines. And that's unsurprising because, like you said, it's such a powerfully subjective interior experience. And it's going to be individuated in me and in my consciousness and in my tradition. And therefore, that as you draw that individuation down, you're going to get significant differences, especially at high resolution. I just feel like we often conflate them. For instance, in the perennial tradition, we'll conflate them because we kind of all want them to be saying the same thing. Yeah. And so we're like really happy not to look at them too closely because then that begins to evaporate. And to me personally, I think it's a disservice to these great mystics because it means that you get to preserve their sanctity, but you do that at the cost of not really studying them very deeply. And I think that's a lost opportunity.